Have you ever felt depressed, anxious, in a brain fog, and you didn't know why because everything in your life was going great? Have you been on multiple antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds and you still didn't feel great? Well, then you'll want to stay tuned because you could possibly have an issue with something called methylation. And this is often an overlooked cause by doctors, including myself before I had my functional medicine training, as a cause of anxiety, depression, and brain fog. Hi, I'm Dr. Var, and welcome to my channel. I'm a board-certified family medicine physician, and I'm also certified in functional medicine. So today we're going to talk about methylation. So methylation is a crucial biochemical process. It is where a methyl group, which is composed of one carbon and 3 hydrogen, are added from one substance to another. And that substance can be your DNA, it can be an amino acid or protein, or it can be an enzyme. So methylation is important because it plays a role in DNA repair, in gene expression, in neurotransmitter metabolism and production, and also in detoxification of your hormones, drugs, and heavy metals. And there are tons of methylation processes going on at the same time, and I'm going to go over a few of those today. Having disruptions in your methylation can lead to mood disorders, cardiovascular disease, cognitive disorders, and even cancers. It also plays a role on whether a gene should be expressed or not. So it's very important. So I'm going to go over different parts of the methylation cycle and also talk about some of the gene mutations that are associated with these particular parts of the methylation cycle and how it can affect you. So the first part of the methylation cycle that I'm going to talk about is folic acid metabolism. Folic acid is actually a synthetic compound. It's not something that our body actually makes. Folic acid is found in fortified processed foods. It's also found in a vitamin, in a multivitamin. So what happens is our body cannot use folic acid. Our body has to convert it into something called methylfolate. And the methyl part means that that methylfolate can be what's called a methyl donor. So that can be used in many different methylation processes. So what happens is you have an enzyme called MTHFR, and this is used in the process of converting folic acid to methylfolate. So I'm going to go through that right now. So you see here that folic acid gets converted to dihydrofolate, and this is also the form that can be found naturally in foods. So dihydrofolate is the form that can be found naturally in foods, such as leafy greens, and this then gets converted to tetrahydrofolate, and that gets converted to 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate. And do notice that this step requires vitamin B6, which is also called pyridoxine. And then 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate gets converted to 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, or 5-MTHFR, which we'll shorten and call methylfolate. And this requires the use of riboflavin or B2 as a cofactor. And this also requires the MTHFR enzyme. So this is then important because methylfolate, it takes a substance called dihydropterin, as we'll see on this slide here, and it converts that to tetrahydropterin, which I'll call BH4 for short. And this requires the methylfolate for this conversion. So basically this means that the dihydropterin, or BH2, is being methylated by the methylfolate to BH4. And that's important because then BH4 is then used to convert tryptophan, which you get from your diet, into 5-hydroxytryptophan. And then 5-hydroxytryptophan gets converted to serotonin. And then serotonin gets converted to acetylserotonin, and it uses something called SAMe, which is also a substance that has a methyl group to donate, and it donates it to acetylserotonin to become melatonin. So you can see that the methylfolate is important because it makes BH4, which then later on is used to make your serotonin and melatonin. The BH4 is also used to convert L-phenylalanine to tyrosine, and tyrosine then uses BH4 again to make L-dopa, and that gets converted to dopamine. So if you don't have this BH4, then you also will have issues with producing dopamine. BH4 is also used to convert arginine to nitric oxide and citrulline. And nitric oxide is used to help dilate your blood vessels. And this is important because if you don't have nitric oxide, you might be at higher risk for developing hypertension because your blood vessels are more constricted. So as you can see, methylfolate is important to make BH4, which is then important to produce your serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, and nitric oxide. So if you have an issue with this process, then you're higher risk to have issues with mood disorders because you're not making enough serotonin, with sleep disorders because you may not be making enough melatonin. You also could have acid reflux because melatonin is also responsible for strengthening the lower esophageal sphincter of the stomach from the esophagus. And if you don't have enough melatonin, that becomes more relaxed, and then you're more likely to have acid reflux from the stomach into the esophagus. You also may have decreased motivation because dopamine is responsible for helping with motivation. It also plays a role in addictive behavior. So if you don't have enough dopamine, you may be more likely to have addiction, whether that's to drugs or even with food. And then, of course, you can have high blood pressure, which then can increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. So there are some people that have something called an MTHFR gene mutation. And there are two different variants of this MTHFR gene mutation. There is one called the C677T and another one called A1298C. And the C677T tends to have more issues with methylation than the A1298T. So this is where there's a genetic mutation for the MTHFR enzyme. And remember, this MTHFR enzyme is required in the pathway to convert folic acid to methylfolate. So if you have a genetic mutation, then you may not make enough methylfolate. So with your genes, you get one copy from each parent. If you get a copy of the C677T variant from one parent and another one from the other parent, then you are called homozygous, and that just means that you have two copies of a gene. And then if you have a copy of the A1298T from your mother and also from your father, you're homozygous for that particular variant. Now, some people will get a copy of the C677T from one parent and a copy of the A1298C from the other parent, and that is what we call compound heterozygous, and that can also still lead to issues with you not making enough methylfolate. Now, if you just have one copy from one parent and you have a normal variant from another parent, then that usually does not cause many issues because you have a normal copy of the gene, and that usually is enough to make your methylfolate. And then, of course, if you have neither copy of the gene, that's considered normal function. So people who have this MTHFR gene mutation are more likely to have mood disorders, insomnia, and motivation and addictive behaviors because of their decreased production of serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine. You may also be more likely to have cardiovascular disease because you may have higher risk of high blood pressure. So as I mentioned earlier, most of your natural foods that have folate in it, it's in the form of dihydrofolate, and that still has to get converted to methylfolate eventually using the MTHFR enzyme. But some foods do have some amount of methylfolate in it, particularly like the dark leafy greens. It's a small amount, but if you eat 3 to 4 servings a day, that might be enough to help increase the methylfolate in your system, so then you can make the BH4 that then gets used to make your serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, and nitric oxide. So that's one way to try to help improve your methylation if you have the MTHFR gene mutation. So as I mentioned earlier, B6 and B2 are also required for the conversion of folic acid to methylfolate. So by making sure that you do not have deficiencies in these vitamins, that can also help further try to optimize your methylation. And then, of course, some people may not have the MTHFR gene mutation and still have problems with methylation if they have these deficiencies. So even if you don't have the genetic mutation, it still is important to make sure that those vitamin levels are optimal. You can also take a methylfolate supplement, and you want to make sure that it's methylfolate because that is the form that your body can use. You don't want to use folic acid because you have the MTHFR gene mutation, you just cannot convert it. So if you do decide to take a supplement of methylfolate, then definitely you want to make sure it's the methylfolate version and not folic acid. But from a functional medicine standpoint, we always like to try to use food as medicine first. So how do you know if you have an issue with the MTHFR gene mutation? Well, a lot of labs will offer testing. And so you can ask your doctor for the MTHFR gene mutation blood test. However, some insurances may not cover it, so you want to make sure your insurance will cover it because it can be pretty pricey. There also are other functional medicine labs that can do like a cheek swab or offer a blood test that might be a lower cost. So you definitely want to check with your functional medicine practitioner, or even your conventional doctor may not mind ordering the MTHFR blood test. The other thing you can get drawn is something called a homocysteine level. And a homocysteine level will be high if you're not methylating properly. And that's not an absolute, but that's just kind of a guide. It is a way to see if you are methylating properly. And homocysteine, even though the lab range might be higher from a functional medicine standpoint, we want to see it under 7. So the next part that I'm going to talk about is the conversion of methionine to homocysteine. So this is another part that's important in this whole methylation cycle. So methionine is an amino acid that we get from foods. So our body doesn't make it. So you do need to get it from different foods. Methionine gets converted to something called SAMe. Now, if you recall back when I was talking about the conversion of serotonin to acetylserotonin and then acetylserotonin to melatonin, that process from acetylserotonin to melatonin required SAMe. So this just shows you how different parts of the methylation cycle play off of each other. So if you have depression and you can't sleep, then you may have an issue with this conversion of methionine to SAMe because you may not have enough SAMe. So as you see on this chart, SAMe is then converted to SAH or S-adenosyl homocysteine and then to homocysteine. Homocysteine then is converted back and recycled into methionine with the help of the methylfolate. So here's also another place where if you have the MTHFR gene mutation, you may have an issue with recycling homocysteine to methionine. So that's why you may tend to have high levels if you have the MTHFR gene mutation. But homocysteine requires methylfolate and then also requires B12 and methionine synthase to convert it back into methionine. Now, some people will have a genetic mutation with methionine synthase. There are two, MTR and MTRR. And so if you have high homocysteine, then there's a chance that you could also have this genetic mutation. So this is important because then if you can't recycle back to methionine, then you may end up making less SAMe. And because SAMe plays a role in many other methylation processes in the body, then you could have other symptoms. Now, the other thing I want to mention, you may see on here that zinc is also needed to convert homocysteine to methionine because it is a carrier. And then the B12 is also needed, but B12 has to be in what we call an unoxidized form. So if someone is taking a B12 supplement because they have a B12 deficiency and it is in the cyanocobalamin form, especially if it's oral, because oral is hard to absorb in the first place, but the cyanocobalamin form is an oxidized form of B12. So it doesn't work well here in the conversion from homocysteine to methionine. It can't be used. It has to be an unoxidized form. So if you're taking B12 because of this issue, then it needs to be a different form. It needs to be either hydroxycobalamin or methylcobalamin. Those are unoxidized forms of B12. And those can be used to help convert homocysteine to methionine. Our bodies are remarkable because they have backup systems. And because it's important to get methionine from your food, convert to SAMe, then that eventually gets converted to homocysteine, which then gets recycled back to methionine. If that process it goes awry, there's a backup system, and that is the BHMT pathway. And this is where it uses trimethylglycine or betaine to convert homocysteine to methionine. Now, I do want to make a side note mention. The betaine comes in a supplement that we use for people that might have low stomach acid. That is a different type of betaine. That's betaine HCl. So that's a more acidic form of betaine. But the betaine that is used to convert homocysteine to methionine, if you were to take an extra supplement, you want to get the trimethylglycine form, because you don't want someone to end up with a stomach acid if they don't need it. So I just want to make that clear that there are different forms of betaine as well. Now, homocysteine also can get converted to cystathione and then to cysteine, which then gets converted to glutathione and taurine. And glutathione is important because that helps your body detox all kinds of substances. So if this part of the cycle is not working properly, then you may have issues with detoxification. And this also requires B6, so it is important to make sure your B6 is adequate as well. So I want to mention this because this glutathione pathway can turn off if you have high levels of homocysteine. You may have to go to a specific functional medicine lab to get tested for the methionine synthase mutation. But if you do have it, you want to do things to optimize. So some people can take the trimethylglycine, so that way this alternative pathway will kick into gear to help recycle the homocysteine and the methionine, and then you'll make adequate SAMe. The other thing is that this process can also be blocked by alcohol, or if you have candida overgrowth. So you want to make sure that you limit your alcohol, and you also want to make sure that you don't have any candida. And one of the ways that you can tell if you have this is you might have an elevated MCV, which you can see on your blood count results. Not everybody who has an elevated MCV above 100 have a methionine synthase gene mutation, but it's something to look at as a clue. You can also support the homocysteine to methionine pathway by taking zinc, B12, and the methylfolate. So the last pathway I'm going to talk about is the COMT pathway. So COMT is an enzyme that is used to help metabolize your dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. So dopamine gets converted to norepinephrine, and that gets converted to epinephrine, and then they get cleared out using the COMT enzyme. So with the COMT enzyme, you can have different forms. You can have COMT val variant, you can have COMT val met variant, or you can have COMT met variant. Now, the COMT val met variant is what we consider normal. You will have a normal amount of the COMT, and it will be running in a normal rate. There are some people that their COMT enzyme is upregulated, meaning that it basically metabolizes the norepinephrine and epinephrine faster, and that is the COMT val variant. Norepinephrine is needed for focus. People who have the val variant are more likely to have ADHD because they're burning through the norepinephrine faster, so they're not able to focus. People who have the COMT met variant are slower metabolizers. So then what happens is they have norepinephrine and epinephrine hanging around longer than they should. And so they may actually have more panic attacks because the norepinephrine is adrenaline. It gets you going. So I also want to mention there are also some important cofactors in the COMT enzyme metabolizing your norepinephrine and epinephrine, and that is magnesium and SAMe. So if you have a magnesium deficiency and a COMT fast metabolizer, then you may even have more focus issues. So the COMT enzyme also plays a role in estrogen metabolism. There are different forms of estrogen in the body, which I'm not going to go into detail right now, but the form estrone is one form of estrogen that's in your body that gets converted to 3 metabolites. So one of those metabolites gets converted to another form of estrogen that's not harmful, and then it also gets converted into 2 other metabolites And those two metabolites use the COMT enzyme. So the COMT enzyme methylates those two metabolites into 2-methoxyestrone and 4-methoxyestrone. Well, the 4-methoxyestrone is more cancer-causing than the 2-methoxyestrone. So if you have an issue with your COMT enzyme, you may end up making more of the 4-methoxyestrone, and that can be cancer-causing. Now, normally, if you have good detoxification, you should be excreting these metabolites in the stool. But you can take something called DIM. And what DIM does is it makes this process go more towards the 2-methoxyestrone side. So therefore, you have less of the 4-methoxyestrone, the cancer-causing one. All right, so there are many other methylation processes that go on in your body that is too vast to talk about here today. Methylation is important, and you can make sure you're optimizing your methylation by making sure you don't have any of these genetic mutations that affect your ability to make substances that are important for these methylation processes. You also want to make sure you're detoxifying well, and by doing that, eating plenty of different colors of fruits and vegetables and having a bowel movement every day. You also want to make sure your gut health is optimal, because a lot of these methylation processes require vitamins as cofactors. And if you have gut health issues, then you may not be digesting and absorbing those nutrients. So I hope this video was helpful. I know it's very complex. If you have any questions, please comment below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe, and please share. And I will see you next time.